6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Hi everybody, welcome to a new segment called Scud's a Space Cadet. I'm Scud, and this is the Apollo Saturn V launch in the game Reentry. We're going to be doing this launch with the checklist, and we're going to be breaking down each step of the checklist, what we're doing, why we're doing it, what's happening to the rocket when we do it, and what is some of the stuff being said back and forth during launch, so that if you play the game, rather than just clicking the switches and going with the flow, you kind of have an understanding of what the astronauts were doing, and you can enjoy the game even more. I'm a space nerd. I eat this stuff up. Let's dive in. All right, here we are in the Apollo command module. We are just inside of 25 minutes, which is where the checklist we're running for this event takes place, and that is going to be the launch preparation checklist. The first step in the launch preparation checklist takes place at 25 minutes, and that is the IMU align. So the IMU is the primary tool on board the command module, which lets the command module know what direction it's facing and how fast it's moving in any given direction or orientation. And right now, the IMU is not aligned for launch. In fact, if you look, the IMU has us flying, looks like straight and level, which we're definitely not. We are sitting on a launch pad pointing straight up. So what we need to do is we need to run program 01, which aligns the IMU for launch. We're going to do that by punching in verb 37, enter 01. What we're going to see, program 1 on the top right corner of the diski, and we're going to see a no at light. And then if we look at our primary ADI, or in the command module, it's called the FDAI1, the Flight Director Attitude Indicator, number 1. We're going to see that begin to align. It's going to pitch up to 90 degrees, that black line with the 9 on it. It's going to roll to 90 degrees plus our azimuth angle. We'll explain that here in just a moment. And it's going to show 0 yaw. So it's going to set the inertial measurement unit up to match the position of the spaceship at its time. It does a fast align, and then in the last few handful of seconds, it does a very, very slow fine-tune align. And when it is complete with its alignment, it's going to go to program number 2. The no at light is going to go away, and we're going to see the compute activity or comp activity light flashing, telling us the computer is doing stuff. And what it is doing while it's running program 2 is it is constantly aligning the spacecraft, because we are sitting on the Earth, and for the next 20, 22, 23 minutes, the Earth is rotating and we are tilting with the Earth, which means the IMU is no longer remaining aligned. It needs to be extremely precisely aligned for launch. So program 2 automatically sequences, and then it will just constantly update the alignment as we sit there and wait for launch. So let's talk about why this alignment is important, what we're seeing on the FDAI1 when an alignment is complete, and how that information that is presented there will be pertinent in subsequent checklist steps that are coming up during the launch, or the launch prep. We're going to do this by using Legos. I've got my Saturn V Apollo Lego set, and for the ease of holding it up, I'm only holding the S4B stage with the service module, command module on top, but we're going to use this to explain what's happening, right? So when the rocket launches, it is not just going to fly straight up into space. It doesn't happen that way. What's going to happen is it's going to fly up high enough to get through some of the thickest part of the atmosphere, and then it is going to tip over and accelerate to orbital velocity. We orbit based on speed, not on height. The faster we go, the higher our orbit is, the lower our orbit. So what we need to do is we need to get that rocket pointing forward, downrange, and we need to get some speed in order to go into orbit. But the rocket needs to know which direction it's going to point as it goes downrange, and that is our azimuth, and that is what we're seeing on the roll. So what's going to happen when the rocket launches is it's going to go up, and then it's going to point towards the azimuth. So let's say the azimuth is somewhere over this way. And let's say this little RCS thruster here, this is our up and down pitch axis. The rocket's going to pitch this way, or it's going to tilt this way. So we've got pitch, and we've got yaw as I poke myself in the face here. If we're going to be going that way, the rocket could both pitch and yaw to get that way, but that's a lot more work. So what's going to happen is the rocket is going to launch up, and then it is going to roll itself in a turn so that it can align its pitch axis with the azimuth that it wants to fly. And that way, when it's time to go down range, it just tips in one axis. So it just pitches over and accelerates. So when we look at the FDAI, and it is pointed 90 degrees up with no yaw, the roll is an important thing to note because that is the rolling orientation that it's going to go to in order to pitch down and fly on the proper trajectory at the right azimuth for the orbit that we want to obtain. The next checklist step takes place at T-minus 20 minutes, and that first part of that checklist is telling us we can change the stable X member, which is essentially saying we can go into the command module computer and change our launch azimuth. We're not going to do that on this launch. We're going to leave it set where it's at. The next few steps are configuring the RCS, or reaction control system thrusters, and powering them up. Now let's talk about those real quick. So as you can see on the outside of the service module, there are these protrusions with little rocket nozzles on them. Those are our RCS thruster quads. There are 4 of these, and each one has 4 rocket motors. Those rocket motors can be used to pitch, yaw, and roll the spacecraft, as well as move the spacecraft forward, backward, left, right, or up and down. The checklist is a little bit confusing here because the switches are kind of going all over the place. Some of them are up and some of them are down, and some of them are off. What we're doing is we're turning the AC roll jets off. Those 4 switches are off because we're not going to use the Alpha and Charlie roll jets. The Bravo and Delta BD roll jets are going to go on, and then all the pitch and yaw jets are going to go on. And we are putting some switches up and some down because we're powering some of them from main bus A and some of them from main bus B, so that we have redundancy built into the power going to these RCS thrusters. That way, if we were to lose one of the electrical buses, we would still have some of the thrusters operating. Our next checklist step takes place at T-minus 15 minutes, and this is going to be where we start configuring some of the electrical power and other miscellaneous switches that we need to have ready for launch. We're going to move over to the lunar module pilot seat, and we're going to check that battery C has power. We have 3 batteries on the spacecraft. We will be using during launch batteries A and battery B, but we're not going to be using battery C. It's just sitting there as a backup in case we need it for any reason if we were to lose power on any of the other batteries. But we want to check and make sure that it is charged to 37 to 37.5 volts in case we might need to charge it up here before launch. So we're just checking the voltage on that. And then we are going to go back to main bus A on our DC volt indicator because that's the bus we're going to monitor during launch. We're now moving over to the commander's seat, and the checklist tells us to check FDAI1. It says total attitude equals roll 90 degrees plus azimuth. And I know when it aligned, it rolled clockwise, but we're now looking at this and counting counterclockwise. So if we're to go counterclockwise 90 degrees plus our azimuth, which today is 72.79, or let's call it 73 degrees, 90 plus 73 degrees equals 163 degrees. And if you look at the bottom of the ADI where the arrow is pointing, it is pointing at just about 163 degrees. And that is pulling in from what I talked about earlier. We need to verify the azimuth when we look at this ADI and make sure that it is pointing the correct amount. For the next step, we are going to put our FDAI scale to 5.5. That is going to adjust the sensitivity of the yellow flight director needles and the triangles on the top, bottom, and right, which are our rate indicators. And we're going to adjust the sensitivity of those to something that is appropriate for launch. After that, we're going to check to make sure our rate switch is in high. This is going to be how fast we are able to control the spaceship. We have a high and a low. Next, we're verifying that the translation controller has power. The translation controller is a small T-handle in the commander's left hand, and during spaceflight, that translates the spacecraft forward and backward, left and right, and up and down. However, during launch, the translation controller is what the commander uses to abort. So we want to make sure that that is turned on so that we have that ability to abort if we need to. After that, we're turning our rotation hand controller power on. There are one and two controllers, one for the commander and one for the command module pilot. And we're turning the direct mode on, which gives us direct control of the thrusters, and we're putting that into the up position for both of those to be powered by main bus A and main bus B. After that, we're making sure that the command module computer mode is in free. Free mode means that the gyros on FDAI-1 and FDAI-2 are uncaged, which means they're free to move around, which is what gives us our indication of attitude while we're maneuvering the spacecraft. Next up on the checklist are the BMAGs. So let's talk about those real quick so we understand what they're doing. You'll notice that when we aligned the IMU with program 1, FDAI-1 began to move in roll and pitch and align itself with the attitude of the rocket. However, FDAI-2 did not move at all. It stayed in pretty much a level flight attitude. And that is because in the current configuration for launch, we have it set up so that FDAI-1 is reading off the IMU. However, FDAI-2 is reading off the GDC, or the guidance display computer. This is an entirely separate computer running on its own pieces of equipment as a backup, as a redundancy. Should we lose an IMU or the IMU, we have the GDC there to let us know what's up, down, and left and right, and if we're moving. The GDC gets all of its information on which direction the spacecraft is moving and how fast it's moving in that direction from pieces of equipment called BMAGs, or body-mounted attitude gyros. And we have a couple body-mounted attitude gyros. We have 1 and 2, as they're labeled on the panel. And we are putting all 3 switches, roll, pitch, and yaw, into rate 1. And what that means is that we are telling the GDC computer to get all of its rate data on roll, pitch, and yaw from BMAG 1. That way we know which direction we're moving. Next step is RHC, or rotational hand controllers, 2 of them, and we're going to make sure they're armed. We're going to do that just by looking down at the rotational hand controllers, and we will see a yellow armed in front of those controllers. So the Astro Launch Operations Voice Check, it's just a comm check, right? So why are we flipping switches on the lunar module pilot side and the commander side? Well, what we're testing is not the radios that we're talking through, not the RF or the VHF or the S-band or all the various radios that we're going to use on our way to the moon. What we're testing is that we are talking to mission control through the launch complex, and the command module is hardwired in to a communication system through the launch tower, through an umbilical, through the launch pad, all the way to mission control. And so we're turning off these radios and then doing a comm check and then turning these radios back on so that we are testing that we can talk through the launch complex without feedback or interference from those radios. Next up on the checklist, after the comm check and the radios are back on, is to check that our SPS thrust is in normal. That is this large gray switch, and there is no off position. It is just SPS on and SPS normal. If we were to flip that switch up, it fires the service propulsion engine in the bottom of the service module. We don't want that to fire, so we're checking that it is in the normal position. After that, we're checking our delta V thrust switches, which are under these gray covers, and making sure that they are in the down and off position. Those switches give the command module computer the authority to fire that same engine. We want to make sure those are off. After that, we're going to make sure that the angle of attack percent switch is in the up position, or angle of attack. And what that does is it allows us to monitor the launch vehicle's angle of attack on this indicator here. If that is down in the percent position, it's going to tell us how much thrust we're getting out of the service propulsion engine in percent. So we want it on angle of attack. Next, we're going to move over and put our EDS switch in auto. We're going to check that the 2 engine out switch is in auto and the launch vehicle rates switch is in auto. So let's talk about the EDS system, because that's important. The EDS system is the emergency detection system, and it is monitoring all kinds of stuff on the command module and the service module. But what's important for us now is that it's monitoring things on the Saturn V rocket, and is monitoring the engines and making sure that they're doing what they're supposed to. It's monitoring which direction that rocket is tilting and how fast it's moving. And it's even monitoring the structural integrity of the rocket to make sure that it hasn't blown up or it's not coming apart. And what the EDS system is going to do is it's going to advise the crew of a situation that might warrant an abort. And then if they decide it's time to abort, the commander can use the translation hand controller to initiate an abort. But there are times where we want the system to automatically abort for us, things that the crew might not be able to respond to in time. Of those things, the 2 big ones are losing 2 engines on the Saturn V rocket, or the Saturn V rocket starts to tumble. And that's what we're doing when we put the EDS switch in auto. We're saying, hey, we're giving you the authority to abort for us, and then we're checking to make sure that the launch vehicle and the 2 engine out switch are in auto, telling it these are the things that we might want you to abort for us. And in fact, that's probably one of the worst things that could happen on the rocket, is losing 2 engines, specifically at around the 40-second mark. At around the 40-second mark, we're approaching something called max Q, or max dynamic pressure. And that is where the rocket is hitting the air molecules at the hardest. It is the most amount of force being applied to the rocket from the atmosphere. And if we were to lose 2 engines at that point, where the rocket is very vulnerable because we're pushing through the air so aggressively, if we were to lose 2 engines, if we lost 1, we'd be fine, probably. But if we lose 2, there's a good chance that that rocket will start to yaw or tip at a rate faster than the gimbals on the motors can correct for. It won't be able to straighten itself out, and it's going to start to tumble. And at that point, with that much pressure, if it starts to tumble, the rocket can disintegrate. And NASA studies show that from the time of losing 2 engines to the point of the rocket coming apart could be in the sub 1 second time range. So much too fast for the crew to recognize. There's a high chance they black out, or they're just not able to respond in time. So by putting the EDS switch in auto and those 2 switches, the 2 engine out and the launch vehicle rates in auto, we're telling the EDS system, hey, keep us alive if these things happen. We're next going to put our RCS command into off. So what does that do and why? Well, the RCS command is the computer controlling the RCS thrusters, and we don't want the computer to fire the RCS thrusters, because if it does, inadvertently or accidentally, it could move the rocket off telemetry. It could move it away from where it's supposed to go. That's on the service module. And if the command module rockets were to fire the RCS thrusters, they're underneath the boost protection cover, which is this white cover that surrounds the command module. So they would be pushing rocket gases out under this command module boost cover. That could cause damage or problems. So by putting that switch in off, we're inhibiting the system from inadvertently firing those rockets. After that, we're going to move over to our left-hand side from the commander seat, and we're going to turn our thrust vector control on. We're putting thrust vector control 1 in AC1 main bus A and thrust vector control 2 in AC2 main bus B, so redundant power supplies. The thrust vector control is what allows us to move the spacecraft in a given direction, what allows us to move it up, down, left, right, or forward or backward. And though our RCS thrusters are off, we want the thrust vector control on so that the computer's up and running and ready in the event of an abort. It knows what to do. The next checklist step takes place at 10 minutes, and that is our FC React valve latch. There's the valve there, and let's talk about why we're doing that. So right now the spacecraft is being powered by the fuel cells. You can see we have fuel cells 1, fuel cell 2, and fuel cell 3 powered. The pumps are on, and you can see if I move to fuel cell 1, we have a flow of hydrogen and oxygen. Fuel cell 2 has a flow of hydrogen and oxygen, and fuel cell 3 has a flow of hydrogen and oxygen. Now, those valves that open up to let the hydrogen and oxygen flow into the fuel cell, and it combines, which creates electricity, which also creates water that we'll use later. The valves that allow those reactants into the fuel cell, they could accidentally close due to the violent shaking of the Saturn V rocket. We don't want those to close because we don't want to lose our fuel cells, because they're providing a majority of our power. So we're going to flip the latch switch into the latch position, and what that's going to do is that's going to force the valves to stay open. We're locking them open, and while that's in the latch position, we cannot close them, and that is going to prevent them from inadvertently closing during launch. The next checklist step is the secondary cooling loop pump off. So let's talk a little bit about that briefly. In the command module, service module unit, we are running 2 liquid cooling systems. The glycol liquid cooling systems, there's a primary and a secondary. And think of them like the water cooling on a high-end PC. They're pumping coolant, glycol, through the environmental control system and through the electrical system to cool off the electrical components, to absorb the heat from the astronauts and keep everything running at a nice temperature so that it doesn't overheat. And we have 2 systems. We have a primary and a secondary, like I mentioned. We are only using the primary right now, and we're only going to use the primary during launch. There's no reason to use the secondary. We're not creating enough heat to, and most of the time they didn't use both at the same time anyways. So we're going to make sure that the secondary cooling loop pump is off, just to make sure it's secure so we're not wearing those parts out. We're keeping that kind of in reserve in case we need it as a backup system. The next checklist step takes place at 4 minutes and 10 seconds. And what we are looking at for this is the launch vehicle engine lights. These are the the round white lights right next to your FDAI. And we see launch vehicle engines, or LV engines, and we have 5 lights numbered 1 through 5. Those represent the engines on the Saturn V rocket, and at 4 minutes and 10 seconds, we want to see that all 5 of those lights illuminate. What is happening at about the 4 minute and 10 second mark is the Saturn V rocket is preparing the engines for ignition. It's starting to open some valves. It's starting to prime the engines. Its computers that control the firing of the engines are getting ready. The ignition system is getting ready. And so if we don't see all 5 lights turn on, that means that one of the engines may have a problem and is not getting itself ready for ignition. So we're just watching to make sure that all 5 of those lights turn on. The next checklist step takes place at 4 minutes, and it's a comm check followed by verb 75. So what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that the DSKY is still showing program 2 and that program 2 is still running, and we are going to punch in verb 75 and not push enter. There are usually some comms that go along with this in the game to kind of give you some immersion. We'll listen to those real quick.
All right, CMP on panel 2, DSKY verify program 2. Program 2. All right, CMP on panel 2, DSKY insert verb 75 and do not enter. Verb 75, stand by.
Why are we doing this? Why are we punching in verb 75 and not pushing enter? This is critical. So at launch, when we lift off, the point where the rocket leaves the launch pad, that sends a signal to the command module computer to sequence to program 11. And 11 is the launch program. And that's important that that runs. It's actually one of the things we check for at launch, is to make sure that program 11 is running. But if something were to go wrong and we didn't get a signal sent to the computer, and so the computer never sequenced to program 11, we need to initiate that. And what we do to initiate that is we activate verb 75, which is backup launch program. But with the rocket shaking, the Saturn V creating all that vibration, it's going to be very difficult for the astronauts to reach up and punch in verb 75 and hit enter. So we preload the verb, we type in verb 75, and we don't press enter. That way, if we run into that problem at launch, all the astronaut has to do is reach up and push one button, enter, and then he's initiated the launch sequence of the computer. At 2 minutes and 15 seconds, the checklist tells us primary glycol to radiator, pull to bypass. We've talked about how we have 2 coolant systems running in this, right? Like the water cooling or liquid cooling in a computer. We are running on the primary coolant system through most of our mission. That primary coolant system takes that hot coolant and puts it into a radiator, just like most water cooling systems on a computer have a radiator. In the Apollo command service module, that radiator, or those radiators, are the white panels on the outside skin of the service module. And the fluid flows through those, it radiates the heat out into space and cools that fluid back off. However, during launch, as we rip through the atmosphere, the outside of the rocket is going to get really hot. And we don't want the coolant flowing through the radiators if the radiators are getting really super hot, because all that will do is heat the coolant up, which will make it a lot harder to cool off the electronic equipment and keep the cabin cool, which means we're going to overheat the computers and the electronics, and we're going to overheat the astronauts. So we're going to pull the primary glycol to radiator to the bypass position, which is just shutting off the radiators. We're telling it don't go to the radiators. And that's to keep the environmental system operating correctly during the heat of launch. At 1 minute and 15 seconds, we are going to move over to the lunar module pilot side, and we are going to tie the batteries into the electrical system. The fuel cells are powering the spacecraft right now, but just to give us redundancy and backup in case fuel cells were to go offline, and to help augment the electrical system during high electrical loads during launch, we're going to tie the batteries into the electrical system by switching the main bus tie bat AC and bat BC switches into the up-on position. Now, what that does on the left switch is it ties battery A to the main bus A electrical system, and on the right switch, it ties battery B to the main bus B electrical system. After that, at the 1 minute mark, we're going to turn the PADCOM system off. That same Astro Launch Complex system that we were just talking about a minute ago, we don't need that anymore. We're about to disconnect from the launch pad. We're going to leave it all behind when the umbilicals are pulled, so we're going to turn the PADCOM off. One of the things that I missed here on my little demonstration is that in addition to turning the PADCOM off, we should be turning the VHF volume up to a higher than normal listening level, because shit's about to get loud. And the last checklist step on this is at 45 seconds, we GDC align. Now, I talked about how the guidance display computer does not align when we align the IMU, and the IMU has been updating its alignment with Program 2 throughout this checklist. But we now, as we're getting down to the wire and close to launch, we need to align the GDC to the IMU and make sure that it is at the right attitude. So what I do is I move the camera down when I'm in 2D view so that I can see both the FDAIs, and we're going to push and hold the GDC align button. And while we push and hold that, we're going to watch FDAI2 and make sure that its alignment matches FDAI1. And when it stops moving, we can release. And now both of our computers that give us rate and attitude information are aligned appropriately for launch. So that is the end of part 1 of the Reentry Apollo Saturn V launch, running through the boost preparation checklist. On the next part, we'll run the actual boost checklist from 9 seconds down through launch and into orbit. So if you like this, we want to see more, let me know. Otherwise, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you on the next one.